Well, the American Farm Bureau just released their Farm Bill priorities, and certainly the Farm Bill, one of the more significant pieces of agricultural legislation that we talk about. And there's over 60 different priorities over all the different titles that they release based upon the current policy we have. But generally speaking, there are four primary objectives that we're looking at when it comes to the next Farm Bill, and that's number one is to maintain crop insurance. That's always been number one for us. And continuing that risk management program, making sure that that survives, that producers have access to adequate risk management coverage is really important. We also want to support, Farm Bill funding, make sure we continue to have enough money to fund the rest of the program. And certainly given the, trajectory of where things are looking at in Washington, that's certainly going to be a battle, and trying to make sure that producers have access to the capital they need is going to be important. So that's number two. Maintaining a unified Farm Bill. And that's certainly one that's challenging to some people. The idea of keeping the nutrition and farm program stuff together doesn't make sense for many people, and we certainly understand that. But politically speaking, that is the way we get farm bills across the finish line, is to maintain those two into one piece of legislation. Nutrition still really makes up nearly 80% or just at 80% of overall spending, and so it's hard to, sometimes folks, they call it a farm bill versus a food bill, whatever that is, but trying to make sure those are maintained together. And then lastly, the fourth item is to try to make sure that USDA has the funding that it needs to adequately, work through these programs and present these programs to farmers and ranchers across the country. We want to make sure there's staff available. Nebraska's had its challenges with some offices that weren't able to find staff people, so that's a challenge. But we want to make sure that funding is available to where, again, it's one thing to have the programs, it's another thing to make sure they work properly. And so we need to make sure that all four of these pieces, again, overarching principles, are included. And there's a lot of pieces underneath all of these, but certainly that's where we're going to start as we start talking to members of Congress about what we need in the next Farm Bill. So politically, as we look at this next Farm Bill, it's certainly one that's going to be challenging. And if we get into next year and we work through a real Farm Bill process where we're having committee hearings, the House and Senate Ag committees have already had some initial Farm Bill hearings, but there's a lot more work to do. We will start, the idea, we'll have to see who's in charge. That's number one on that list. If Republicans take over the House or the Senate or both, if there's a leadership change there, that's certainly going to affect the drafting of this next Farm Bill in a pretty big way. Second of all, we have to see, what the chairman's priorities will be. And certainly, again, that switch over in terms of leadership could mean a pretty significant swing. And then we have the spending side of things. And if Republicans take over, what does that mean in terms of Farm Bill spending? We've got some spending priorities we would like, and they're certainly not cheap. And then you have the nutrition side of things, where we're looking at potentially our very first $1 trillion Farm Bill over the course of 10 years. That's a lot of money. And if you have more fiscally minded lawmakers coming in, where does that weigh into this conversation? So certainly an awful lot yet to be considered on the political side that will have a direct impact on the policy side as well. The timeline will be a little bit more difficult, I think, than what farm bills we've had in the past. Historically, we have our typical 5-year window, and then we start hearings. We go through that process. You go through committee markups, and then you see what happens as it hits the House and Senate floors. From a Nebraska standpoint, we're going to have our own priorities, I think, that run right along with American Farm Bureaus, but at the same time, maybe chew around the edges a little bit on some specifics, way in the weeds of policy. Senator Fisher just released her changes in a piece of legislation to the Emergency Conservation Program. Trying to make sure that program works better, trying to make sure all emergency programs work better is something we've heard from members for a while, and trying to make sure that those work in emergency situations, and so that funding gets to where it needs to go quickly. That's certainly something I think you'll see in a farm bill debate. The livestock conversation, what that looks like, and what pieces of legislation try to get rolled into the farm bill, that'll certainly be a large large topic of conversation as well. And again, we're going to have to see what we have for policy. I mean, overarching, we announced some broader overall priorities, but we still have to go through our policy development process. I'm sure there will be a number of Farm Bill related things that come from our counties on that. I had 9 individual questions that I was hoping our members would answer, and certainly would encourage you all to take a look at those in our policy development guides and try to provide answers for those 9 questions from a policy standpoint. Those are really, if you get into the weeds of what this next Farm Bill looks like, we're going to need to have answers for those questions. And then lastly, this whole conversation on climate, I think, is one we're going to have to try to answer. And there will be attempts to try to include climate provisions in the Farm Bill. What do we think of that? Do we have struggles with ideas of which a lot of people would like to do, tie climate practices to federal crop insurance, tie climate practices to conservation programs, like was done, like has been done with this additional funding that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, you know, there's a lot of pieces here that we're going to have to try to have answers to that we don't have policy on at this time, and certainly would encourage you all, if you have strong opinions on those, please submit those through our policy development process as well.